and welcome back to She Investigates, the podcast where we investigate all things weird. I'm your host, Gwen Ross, and today I've got something completely different for you. Today we're going to be talking about 2 different times when the testimonies of ghosts have been used to solve their own murders. These 2 cases range from Australia all the way to West Virginia and occurred over a span of 70 years. And yet, they have a very interesting connection that you will not see coming. But first, let's catch up. I have a very important question for you guys. Are you watching Severance? And if you're not, are you living under a rock? It's seriously everywhere right now. One of my friends suggested it, and me and my husband are hooked. I've got to be honest, the first 4 episodes or so, you're just kind of constantly asking yourself, what the heck is even happening? But just keep going. Trust me, you're going to understand more later. So I wanted to kind of tell you a little bit about the premise of the show. Don't worry, I'm not going to give any spoilers. I wouldn't do that to you. But basically, it's this company that has invented this surgical procedure so that you can split your work life from your personal life. So when you're at work, you don't have any idea what your life is like on the outside. Like, you don't know if you're married, you don't know if you have kids. And while you are on the outside, you have no idea what you do for work at your job or like who your coworkers are or anything. And it's kind of funny because their work selves are called their innies and their personal selves are called their outies. And the first time they said that, I laughed a lot. I kind of got more used to it after we had been watching a couple of episodes, but that just makes me think of belly buttons. But anyways, it's been like 3 years since they had a new season of this show. There's only 1 full season out right now, and the 2nd season just started. And the end of season 1 is like this massive cliffhanger. I would be so mad if I had just like watched season 1 when it came out and then had to wait 3 years for a whole new season. But luckily, we found it at the right time, and we only have to wait a week between episodes, and trust me, that feels long enough. This is not sponsored in any way. I'm nowhere near big enough for sponsors, but if you haven't watched this show, you need to watch it. It's on Apple TV, and I know it's just another TV subscription. I have them all too. It's really annoying, but this is honestly like the most original new show that I've seen in a long time. Like, me and my husband binged the whole thing in just a couple of nights, so I feel like it's worth it. We had to subscribe to Apple TV to even be able to watch it, and I feel like it's been worth it. And if you have seen it, message me because I need more people to bounce theories off of than just my husband. And with that, let's jump into today's case. Our first story takes us to Campbelltown, New South Wales in the early 19th century. This quiet settlement was a growing community where life was tough but simple. It's here that we find Frederick Fisher, a successful and well-liked farmer who became the subject of one of Australia's most famous ghost stories. He had made some poor choices in the past, the details of which I wasn't really able to find, but by the time he made his way to Campbelltown, he was what is known as, quote-unquote, a ticket of leave man, and that basically was just a fancy way of saying that he was on parole. So he had some money, he owned some land and some property, and he bought a large farm in Campbelltown. He was basically just trying to make a life for him there, kind of start over. He had a good reputation in the community, and lots of people liked him. But he was not without his troubles. And in 1825, Fred Fisher and a local carpenter, William Brooker, had an argument over money. And during the course of this argument, Fisher pulled out a knife. Now, luckily, William Brooker was not badly hurt, but Fred Fisher was arrested. As we know, you cannot go pulling knives on people when you're on parole. Well, ever, but especially not when you're on parole. So, he was afraid about how long he was going to be in jail. So, Fred Fisher gave George Worrell, who lived on the neighboring farm, and coincidentally, or not coincidentally, was also a ticket of leave man, power attorney over his land during his imprisonment. He ended up not having to serve a very long sentence. His sentence was pretty light, and he returned to his farm a short time later. On June 17th, 1826, Fisher disappeared without a trace. At first, all of his neighbors were kind of concerned, but they were reassured by his friend and neighbor, George Worrall. He claimed that Fisher had just decided to return to England. Worrall even presented a letter that was supposedly written by Fisher, stating his intentions to leave and granting Worrall power of attorney over his affairs. However, not everybody was convinced. The rumors started to spread, and suspicion started to fall on Worrall, especially as he began to sell off Fisher's property. 3 weeks after Fred Fisher's disappearance, George Worrall sold Fisher's horse and a bunch of his personal belongings, claiming that Fred Fisher had sold them to him before he set sail for England. But without evidence of foul play, the matter just seemed destined to remain unresolved. That is where this tale takes an eerie turn. Late one night, in October 1826, several months after Fisher's disappearance, a local man named John Farley stumbled into a local hotel in a state of shock and claimed that he had seen the ghost of Frederick Fisher. According to Farley, the ghost of Frederick Fisher, say that 3 times fast, appeared to him one night, sitting on a fence near a creek. The ghost was described as pale and pointing toward a paddock down the creek before vanishing into the darkness. Farley's account spread quickly through the community, and it wasn't long before an investigation was launched. Authorities searched the area near the creek where the ghost had pointed, and what they found confirmed everyone's worst fears. Buried in a shallow grave on Worrall's land was the body of Frederick Fisher, his injuries suggesting that he had been murdered. The discovery led to the arrest of George Worrall. During his trial, the evidence against him, including his suspicious behavior and that forged letter, was overwhelming. He was executed in 1827, bringing some measure of justice to Frederick Fisher. On the scaffolding, Worrall confessed that he had murdered Fred Fisher by mistake, thinking that he was a horse in the wheat crop. However, not very many people actually believed this, especially the locals. Most people thought that George Worrall had assumed, when he had been appointed Fred Fisher's agent, that all of Fisher's property belonged to him. And then when Fisher was released from prison, George Worrall murdered him to fully obtain his property. Although tales of the supernatural were not allowed in the courtroom, it is safe to say that John Farley's ghostly vision started the ball rolling towards justice. It is thought by some that the story of the ghost may have been invented by Farley as a way of concealing some other source of his knowledge about the whereabouts of Fisher's body, but this cannot be confirmed. The story of Fisher's ghost has become a really big part of Australian folklore, and they actually have a festival every year in Campbelltown. The Fisher's... I am having such a hard time saying Fisher's today. Fisher's Ghost Festival. And it's held every November, and it's one of the longest running community festivals in the country. It's kind of a unique blend of history and culture and entertainment, and they actually get lots of visitors from near and far to attend this festival. There's food, there's a parade, live music, carnival rides, and for those that are interested in the ghostly legend itself, there's storytelling sessions, historical reenactments, and even guided tours to key locations linked to the tale, which I think sounds really fun. It's a time when Campbelltown comes alive with the spirit of its past, honoring both the tragic tale of Frederick Fisher and the resilience of the local community. But what really happened that night? Was it truly Fisher's spirit guiding the community to uncover the truth? Or was it a case of a guilty conscience and communal intuition leading to justice? Now we're going to jump forward a few decades. It's 1897 in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. The setting? A quiet rural community where life moves at a slower, simpler pace. But beneath the peaceful surface, a dark story was brewing. A story that would blur the lines between life and death, the natural and the supernatural. Let's start at the beginning. Zona Hester Shue was a 23-year-old woman described as kind and spirited. In October 1896, she met and quickly fell for a drifter named Edward Stribling Trout Shue. Yes, quite the name. He was a blacksmith who'd recently moved to Greenbrier County. Despite her mother's objections, Zona married Edward Shue. Now fast forward to January 23rd, 1897, and Zona's body was discovered by a young boy who had been sent to her home on an errand. She was lying at the foot of the stairs, her body eerily positioned, as if she'd simply collapsed while descending. Now, Edward, upon hearing of her death, displayed extreme grief, cradling her body and preventing anyone from examining her closely. The local doctor, George W. Knapp, initially attributed her death to an everlasting faint, which I didn't know what that was. I looked it up, and it basically said that back in this day, it was basically what they classified any woman's death when they didn't know what she had died from. And it was later classified as being due to childbirth complications. That was strange because there'd never been prior indication that Zona was even pregnant, so that kind of fell out of left field. Edward was extremely emotional, and whenever the doctor tried to do a more thorough investigation of the body, he would get really upset. So the doctor didn't push the matter, and Zona was buried 2 days later. But that is not where her story ends. Zona's mother, Mary Jane Hester, was convinced from the start that her daughter's death was no accident. She had never trusted Edward, and she believed that he was responsible. So Mary Jane prayed fervently for answers, and according to her account, Zona's spirit visited her over the course of 4 nights. In these visits, Zona's ghost described how Edward had been abusive and controlling. On the night of her death, she claimed that he had flown into a rage over a meal she'd prepared. The argument had turned violent, and he broke her neck. To prove her claim, the ghost allegedly showed her mother the twisted, unnatural position of her neck. Now, this is interesting because before she was buried, she was dressed in a dress that had an extremely high neck that had been chosen by Edward. Mary Jane took her story to the local prosecutor, John Preston. She went all mama bear. She wanted this to be investigated. And he was skeptical at first, but he couldn't ignore her conviction. And that to me says she wasn't taking no for an answer. She wanted this to be investigated. There was also community rumors about Edward's past, including 2 previous marriages, both of which had ended under mysterious circumstances. So after speaking with Dr. Knapp, information began to surface about the less than thorough autopsy that he had conducted. The townspeople were also talking about Edward's weird behavior at the wake. He wouldn't let anybody close to the casket, and he never let the casket out of his sight. He had also placed a pillow on one side of her head. So John Preston, he had heard enough, and he ordered Zona's body to be exhumed. An autopsy was conducted, well, I should say a more thorough autopsy was conducted, and it confirmed that what the ghost had said was true. Zona's neck was indeed broken. Her windpipe was crushed, and ligaments were torn. Edward Shue was arrested and charged with her murder. The trial began in June 1897. The prosecution's case was built on the autopsy findings and Edward's questionable behavior. But here is where this court case takes a supernatural turn. Mary Jane Hester did testify about her ghostly encounters with Zona. While the defense tried to discredit her, the jury was reportedly swayed by her unwavering belief in her daughter's testimony. The jury took only an hour and 10 minutes to return a verdict. Edward was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He died 3 years later, and Zona's spirit was never seen again. So, what do we make of this case? Was it a grieving mother's intuition, or did Zona really reach out from beyond the grave? While skeptics might dismiss the ghost story, it's undeniable that Mary Jane's testimony played a key role in bringing justice to her daughter. Today, a historical marker sits along Route 60 and reminds all who traverse the winding mountain roads that the Greenbrier Ghost helped convict her own killer. It reads, quote, "Interred in nearby cemetery is Zona Hester Shue. Her death in 1897 was presumed natural until her spirit appeared to her mother to describe how she was killed by her husband Edward. Autopsy on the exhumed body verified the apparition's account. Edward, found guilty of murder, was sentenced to the state prison. Only known case in which testimony from ghost helped convict a murderer." Close quote. Even though these two murders happened a world away from each other and 70 years apart, they share a crazy connection. In the year 1897, the same year as Zona Shue's murder, the story of Fisher's ghost was still making the rounds in newspapers all over the world. Remember when I said that it was one of Australia's most famous ghost stories? I wasn't kidding. It was still being talked about all those years later. It was being printed in newspapers from Sydney to London to Maryland, and eventually it landed on the front page of the Lewisburg, West Virginia Greenbrier Independent on January 28, 1897. And guess what was also printed on page 3 of that very same newspaper? The death notice for Zona Hester Shue. That's why some people say that the story that Zona's mother told about seeing her ghost was inspired by reading about the ghost of Fisher. Now, go with me for a minute. Is it really crazy to think that Zona's mother was reading the paper that day, specifically looking for her daughter's death announcement, and stumbled upon the story of Fisher's ghost, and thought to herself, maybe this will work for me? We already know that she never liked Edward, and she didn't trust him. She didn't want him to marry her daughter, and she had strong suspicions that he had killed her. But at that point, her daughter was probably already buried. Case closed. So she comes up with this plan to pretend that she saw her daughter's ghost in order to get the ball of justice rolling. I can't say that it's a horrible plan, and if it was her plan, it worked. All I can picture is Tevye in the musical Fiddler on the Roof, where he's trying to deliver the hard news to his wife that he has given his daughter permission to marry somebody else even though she's already betrothed. He makes up a dream where he sees Grandma, who is passed on, and she's congratulating the daughter on getting married to the new man that the dad has promised that she can marry. It's a big, elaborate dream sequence where the ghost of the dead wife of the man she's betrothed comes and says that if she marries him, she will kill her a few days later. The mom is so freaked out by this dream that she agrees that the daughter should in fact break off the betrothal and marry the other guy. That was Tevye's plan all along. That might have been kind of a confusing explanation, but my musical theater people out there, you know what I'm talking about. Now, there's no evidence to really support this theory, but is it possible, even dare I say likely? I think so. Although this doesn't really explain how she knew the exact cause of death that was later verified in the autopsy. Katie Letcher Lyle wrote a book called The Man Who Wanted 7 Wives, The Greenbrier Ghost and the Famous Murder Mystery of 1897. And she makes a strong case that the Australian ghost story influenced Hester. She said, quote, "In any event, there are the two news stories. One on page 3, the notice of Zona Hester Shue's death. On page 1, the account of how the supposed intervention of a ghost had been used to bring a murder to justice. That the slain girl's mother read both stories and then decided to use the device described in the second to force the authorities to reopen the case seems obvious." Close quote. We may never know if these two cases are indeed connected, but they remind us of our deep connection to the souls of loved ones even after they've passed. The murders of both Fisher and Zona Shue were unfortunate and brutal, but thanks to some help from the other side, they were finally able to get the justice they deserved. Reading this story, I thought about how times are so different now. Someone would never be arrested, let alone convicted, based only on the evidence of a dream or a vision. In fact, in my research for this episode, I tried to find more modern examples to add in, and I wasn't able to find any. And that's because evidence today has to be considered research-based and reliable. Then you also have the problem of the inability to cross-examine a ghost witness. Although in today's modern court system, we aren't hearing tales of ghosts appearing, in a way, some victims are still able to give testimonies in their own murder trials. Today it might look like reading text messages from the victim's phone, following their movements on GPS, or looking at their most recent posts on social media. The goal then and the goal now is the same, to give victims a voice. And in some cases, like our stories today, it may even lead to the conviction of their own killer. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode, and I want to know what you guys think. Are these two cases connected, or was it all just a weird coincidence? So let me know on the Instagram post for this week. And if you liked this episode, please consider subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts or giving us a 5-star review. Until next time, I'll be snooping so you don't have to. This is She Investigates, signing off.